I know you're nervous. It's going to be okay. I want to talk to you tonight about story and storytelling, and in particular, stories that are spoken out loud in a particular place, at a particular time, to a particular group of people, by a particular person. And those stories, that kind of story, in that context, has a special power that no other story has. I'm not going to say anything that has never been said before, and I may not say it as well, but I'm speaking to you here, right now, and that's what makes it special. I have somehow, for the past 30 years, managed to make a living telling stories. And it's only recently that I've really come to understand what I barely intuited all those years ago, which is that stories is how we make sense. Stories are how we make sense of our lives, how we explain to God how we got where we are, how we imagine where we might go. I think actually that story making is at the very center of what it is to be human. Stories are patterns, but they're patterns in time. And that means they have to do with context, about putting things in context. And we are creatures of context, of this place, of this time, of this moment. Now, the pattern of a story is made up of events. Events are things that happened or might have happened or we think happened or imagine that could happen, and they're put together in a particular order. And it's this order that gives meaning. I want to say that again. Stories are how we assign meaning. And let me tell you a story about that. A number of years ago, I was working in a school. I was working with sixth graders, and I was telling stories and having them write and tell their own. And I was using different story patterns. And one of the patterns I was using was the hero's quest. Those of you know Joseph Campbell's work are probably familiar with that idea. The hero, the protagonist, is called away from home. They're called to adventure. And on the road, they meet a helper, someone who goes with them or gives them some advice. And they get to this strange place, this place they've never been before, a dangerous place. And they're called upon to pass a test. And in passing that test, they're given a boon, a treasure, and they bring it home. Now, this story, with the names changed or the places changed, has been told or sung or danced or written or filmed or drawn millions and millions of times. Jack and the Beanstalk, Jason and the Golden Fleece, the Lord of the Rings, the Hunger Games. And there was one kid in one class who did nothing all month long. He sat in the back with his chair against the back wall, and he didn't even speak. And this was very frustrating. But I had a blessing, which was I was not part of the curriculum, so I didn't have to make him do anything. We do not know what silence means. And then at the very end, when all hope was lost, he stood up in class and he told this incredible story about a boy whose father had died. And the boy decides to go to the land of the dead. And on the way, he meets a strange little man who gives him a sword. And he gets to the land of the dead. And in the land of the dead, there's the house of the dead. And his father is in the house of the dead, but it's protected by a dragon, a serpent. And he slays the dragon, and he brings his father home. It's perfect. And I look at this kid who has not done anything all month, and in spite of myself, I think, I wonder where he got that story from. And at the end of the class, I turned to the teacher, and I said, that was some story that Jamie told. And she said, yeah, Jamie's father died 3 months ago. What I had done was more important than what I thought I was doing. I thought I was teaching literacy or facility with language or the deconstruction of character and plot. But what I had done instead was give someone an inkling of how to make sense of their life. When something doesn't make sense to us, it means we don't see the story in it. We don't see a pattern. But we want to make sense of it. And so we try to put that event, what happened, into some kind of context. What happened before and what came after. And when we do that, it makes sense. We begin to understand the world. Through me giving that myth to Jamie, I had given him a way to talk about a boy who lost his father. Now, some people would say, but that story's not true. He can't bring his father back from the dead. But to me, that misses the point. Because Jamie's story was an answer he was giving to his own question, which is, how do I carry my father in my life now that he's dead? And the answer, of course, and all of us who have lost people know that, we do it through story. It seems to me that this offering of pattern has very deep implications for those people who call themselves a teacher. And I would like here to define teaching in the broadest of strokes. My definition of a teacher is someone who gives a person a story so that they can make their own. And I'm not talking just about literature and English. I'm talking about history and astrophysics and biochemistry and law and mathematics. All of those things are best explained through story, because story is how we are reminded and how we remember. If we want it to be memorable, it must be a story. Gregory Bateson, an early pioneer in cognitive science, told the apocryphal story about a computer scientist who developed a computer that worked like the human mind. And he tested it by asking the question, how does the human mind work? And the computer responded, that reminds me of a story. We are not built to memorize lists or unrelated facts. We are built to remember narrative. So try this the next time you're giving a lecture or a talk or standing in front of a bunch of people. Stop in the middle of your offering of facts or your closely reasoned argument and say, let me tell you a little story, and watch what happens. You see the faces relax. You see people reseat themselves in their chairs and get ready to hear a story. A friend of mine, Pierre Mornon, I don't know if Pierre's here tonight, he's an anthropology professor, he said that he sees two things happen when he tells a story, when he goes into story mode in class. One is that unconsciously students put down their pencils and pens and stop typing. And then two, a little bit later, a type A student raises his hand and says, is this on the test? And he says, just listen. Because I think a story is what, like Borges said about poetry. He said, a poem is not an argument, it's a suggestion. And that is what stories are. They are suggestions. They are offerings. And they work not just because they're cognitive, but because they're emotional. When we put things in context, one after another, the listener waits to hear what happens next, and they begin to care about the character. And they take the things that happen in the story and they apply them to their lives, and they take the things that happen in their lives and they apply them to the stories. And the real power of the story then is it's safe to think about because it's not about us, and we can look at it. Jamie could stand in front of all those kids and tell a story about a boy who lost his father because it wasn't about him, but it was, but it wasn't, but it was. And it's this in-between place that story lives, and that's why it has power. And I guess the real point I want to make for all of us who are teachers, and who isn't under my broad definition, is that we have a power that no other technology has. For all this burgeoning explosion of media and all these millions of different ways to tell stories, the storyteller is in the room at that moment, in that context, has a power that nothing else has. Only a little more than a month ago, I was working in a school in Massachusetts, and there were 300 primary grade kids sitting on the floor in the gym. And I was telling a traditional Appalachian story, my variant of a story called Sodi Saleratus. And in the middle of this story, I say, the little old girl sashayed out the door, and she sashayed down the road, and she sashayed over the bridge, and she sashayed on into the store. And I stopped, and I said, sashay, that's a weird word. Does anyone know what it means? This is a way for me to stop and check in with the audience to see how they're doing and then give them a little vocabulary lesson because nobody knows. But that day, a little girl, a kindergartner at the very end of the front row raised her hand. And I said, yes. Do you know what it is? She said, it's a ballet step. Well, now that was a surprise to me because I thought it was a square dance step you learned in 4th grade gym class when you didn't want to hold hands with Susan Morgan.
And now I know, and I didn't know this before, that she was actually referring to chassé, which is different, or is it? Sachet, chassé, what are the chances it's the same word? Just the same, it's like evolution right there. But I said, that's great, thanks, I didn't know that. And I go on with the story, and she raises her hand again. And I say, yes, she says, I know how to do it. And I said, well, would you like to show us? And she nods. And she gets up and she faces the audience. She puts her hands parallel to the ground. And she does this little side step all the way across the stage, all the way across the gym, and all the way back. Better than I'm doing it, I might add. And she bows and sits down, and everyone applauds. And now this beautiful thing has happened, because now every time I say the word sachet in the story, everyone has a picture of what's going on. Now, a lot of things have happened in that 45 seconds that took to take place. But what interests me most here is the notions of intimacy and immediacy and adaptability. This is about the context. And only the storyteller in the room can facilitate what happened right then. First of all, the storyteller had to choose what story they were going to tell, judging from the audience. And they had to tell it in a way that the audience could hear it, speeding up, slowing down, all those different things that command attention. And then the storyteller stopped to make sure that the audience was there and give them a little vocabulary lesson. But then we have the serendipity of this child offering this, and the deepening of response as she showed us, until her actions affect all of us. And now, every time someone who's in that room hears the word sachet, they have a picture of her skipping across the floor. And now that I've told you that story, maybe you do too. The good news for flesh and blood storytellers and teachers is that there is no technology created that can do that in the way that we can. And there is no platform that can make money at it. It is a craft that is learned and learned by working and working. We are still genetically encoded to pay attention to the person in front of us. A couple years ago, after I finished a family show, a kid came up to me and said, "You know, you're pretty good for a storyteller, but you're not as good as my dad." And he was right, because I know more stories, and I'm probably a better performer, but his father was there when he needed him. His father is there when the story needs to be told, at the kitchen table, in the car, at bedtime. And his father knows what story to tell, and he knows how to tell it, and he knows when to stop to make sure the kid understands, or to answer the kid's questions, or even to get him a drink of water. Or as we say in the storytelling world, in the oral world that you live into, yeah, the media, it knows more stories, but the storyteller knows us, and you are that storyteller. Thanks a lot.